When I look at the ecological crisis from a Buddhist perspective, what strikes me most, in fact, it really amazes me, is the parallel between what Buddhism has always said about our individual predicament and our collective predicament today. So yesterday morning, I started out talking, and I gave a kind of alternative way of understanding our individual situation. You noticed I didn't talk about the Four Noble Truths, right? But I was kind of giving you my own potted version of what the Buddhist path is about, talking about the sense of self as a psychological and social construct, and it creates this sense of separation, right? The illusion that there's a me inside that's separate from the rest of the world outside. Not just an illusion there, but it's an illusion that causes dukkha. There's a fundamental discomfort because that supposed self inside, being a construct, it doesn't have any reality, any essence. It's a kind of a function of the way that a bunch of sort of mental and physical processes work together, right? And then we experience that as a sense of lack. We could say the sense of self is shadowed, if not haunted, by this sense of lack. The feeling that something isn't quite right, something is wrong with me, something is missing, I'm not good enough. And I think something that all of us at one time or other have experienced, and maybe often, maybe in a persistent sort of way. And then in response to that, how we get caught up in what I was calling lack projects or even reality projects because we don't feel real enough. We look for things, if I can just get enough money, or if I'm famous enough, if you'll all buy my books and read my books, or if I find the perfect partner, or my body is just perfect enough. I mean, all of these things that we get caught up in because at a deep, mostly unconscious level, they will sort of make us feel whole, complete. But they don't work, right? Because those lack projects, trying to find something out here, because they're just symptoms of the fundamental problem, this delusion of separation, none of them can actually ever provide the kind of wholeness that we're looking for. And they also get us trapped in this linear understanding of time where we're always sort of planning to live in the future when everything will be okay, as opposed to now when we still feel this sense of inadequacy. So we're constantly sort of sacrificing, using the present as a means to get somewhere better in the future, right? I hope this sounds familiar. This is what I was talking about yesterday morning, right? And also then going into the solution, understanding, say, the Buddhist path, it can be, and in a way you can consider it a lack project too, but it's a lack project that can work. Because through meditation and other Buddhist practices, basically what's going on is the sense of self is deconstructing, and then we can have this experience of letting go when we realize our non-duality, or as Dogen said, our intimacy with all things, right? And most importantly, this enables this kind of shift, this paravriti, or turning around in terms of the meaning of our lives. As long as we're caught up in these lack projects, there's this preoccupation with me, right? I mean, that just goes along with it, the sense something is wrong, and we're always looking at the world in terms of how it can help us fill up this sense of lack. But if we can let go of ourselves and realize our interdependence, our non-duality with everybody, then there can be this big shift away from what's in it for me to, wow, what can I do? How should I live in a way that makes this a better world for all of us, right? This kind of shift, I think, kind of naturally into what we usually describe as the Bodhisattva path. So that was a quick précis of what I was trying to present yesterday morning. And as I said, what truly astounds me is that also is a really good description of our ecological crisis. That it's exactly the same problem. In fact, to the point that it's like the individual problem is a micro version of the macro problem. Because the sense of self, it's not just individuals, it's not just David Loy, but we have collective senses of self as well, right? So I'm not just David, I'm a man, I'm an American, I'm not Chinese, I'm white, I'm not a person of color, etc. And so, and we see this playing out, of course, so often in terms of collective selves against other collective selves. We see it playing out in terms of nationalism and racism and patriarchy and all that. And so what I want to talk about now is what we might consider the largest collective sense of self. That is to say, we as a now global civilization and having this sense of separation from the rest of the biosphere. Again, the fundamental problem is the sense of separation. And basically everything, all of that detailed parallel that I mentioned before applies. For example, just as the personal or individual sense of self is a psychological and social construct, so maybe this is obvious, our human civilization is our social historical construct, right? And this too has led, guess what, to a collective sense of separation from the rest of the biosphere, from the earth. A collective sense of separation that also leads to dukkha, a kind of dissatisfaction or frustration, involving anxiety and, as I'll try to unpack, uncertainty about the meaning and direction of our now global civilization. And then carrying the parallel further, our main response to this anxiety and this uncomfortable sense of separation has been a collective lack project. And you can talk about this in terms of an attempt to sort of self-ground ourselves. Just as on the individual level, you can understand lack projects as attempts to ground ourselves. But our collective attempt to ground ourselves, let's call it progress, in some ways is just making things worse, just like a lot of our individual lack projects do. In response, do we return to nature? Is the idea going back to nature? Well, we mentioned this last night. Again, this is an amazing parallel, I think. Just as on the individual level, the Buddhist path is not about getting rid of the self, right? But realizing the sense in which there never has been a separate self. And likewise, we can't return to nature because, as we said, we've never been separate from it. But we do need to realize this embeddedness, this groundedness. We do need to realize that the earth is our mother as well as our home. And this collective realization will clarify, I think, in a different way, what it means to be human. Realizing that we, as a species, are part of something greater than ourselves. And maybe that's the essential point. Realization, we are part of something greater than ourselves. Then I think that is kind of naturally going to lead to this answer about the meaning of our lives. Again, on the collective level, we can turn away from, what's in all this for us as a civilization, and then we can ask, given that we're part of something greater than ourselves, what is our role? What role can we play? What role clearly do we need to play given the kind of situation that we find ourselves in? Does that make sense? So basically what I want to do is sort of unpack each of those to sort of clarify and hopefully give you some insight into this really fascinating parallel, right? The first question that's already come up a couple times yesterday is, why do we feel separate from the earth? Right? I mean, why do we as a species feel that we're different than all other species? And in a way we are, in terms of our abilities to think, to coordinate, to do things. Clearly we are a very special species, but that doesn't imply that we're separate, right? Where did the sense of separation come from? And I think there's a couple of different stages, or a couple different aspects to it. One of them is to notice this big difference between hunting-gatherers, who tend to be nomadic to some degree, and agriculture, right? For hunting-gatherers, quote, everything is founded in the conviction that home is already Eden and that exile must be avoided. In other words, hunting-gatherers, in a way, they are dependent on what's there, right? They're not controlling their environment in the same way that agriculturalists are, but they're simply responding to what's available, and especially the food sources. They know at certain times there's berries, at certain times when things are difficult, that there's always roots they can dig up, but there's a sense of embeddedness in the natural world. And so one of the really key shifts was agriculture. And it's hard to imagine, in fact, it's impossible to imagine contemporary civilization without agriculture. And yet, it created a number of problems, right? I mean, on the one hand, once you have agriculture, first of all, you're going to be rooted there. And you're also creating the sense of inside and outside, because now you have your fields. And if you're a pastoralist, now you have the places where the cows and the chickens and the pigs are. And basically, you've got to defend that from the rest of the natural world. For example, the predators that are always a danger, and for that matter, the weeds that are going to grow up in the field. So just to be an agriculturalist is starting to sort of separate from the rest of the natural world. There's also other kinds of problems that agriculture created. Anthropologists have determined pretty clearly that they worked a lot harder than the hunting-gathering. Extrapolating from what we know now, the few hunting-gathering societies that still exist, they only work a few hours a day, if you can call it work, sort of gathering what they need. But agriculture is tough work, as anyone knows if you've done it, right? It takes a lot of work. And interestingly, too, the diet is not as good. It tends to be more restricted, certain types of crops. You do get a lot more people. You can support a lot more people with agriculture, so the society will be bigger. But also it creates the problem, in some ways, the number one problem of civilization that we've never really been able to resolve: class systems. Once you have agriculture, then you tend to develop. You'll have the laborers, and then you'll have the nobles and the priests and the king or the emperor or whoever at the top. Once you're stabilized in that way, you can create palaces and such. Prior to that, if you look at the hunting-gathering, they didn't have classes. In fact, it's fascinating how, if you study hunting-gathering societies, they have lots of customs to make sure that no one sort of emerges that will try to control things. For example, if you have a really good hunter, the hunter may be really good at finding meat, killing the deer or whatever, bringing it back. But in the societies that I've read about, they do not allow the hunter to distribute the meat. In fact, they tend to have this custom where they kind of denigrate. Well, the hunter is expected to say, oh, it was just by accident, I just came across him. And likewise, the other people will sort of go along with that. So it's an interesting custom that seems to be designed to make sure that you don't develop those kinds of status things in the hunting gathering. But once you get agriculture, and every example that we know of, you very quickly develop some very serious classes, right? And another factor, of course, contributing to the sense of separation from nature is, guess what? Religion, right? Lynn White, Jr., a scholar, traced back our contemporary alienation from the natural world back to Christian arrogance toward nature based on texts like Genesis 1:28. I think you're probably very familiar, right? Fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing, right? Now, some of those words can be translated somewhat differently, but nonetheless, I think that has been the accepted understanding, that we are given the earth, we are special, we're created on the last day, we're the only ones made in God's image. Interesting question. Does God have a nose? And what does it mean to be created in His, male pronoun again, image? Which goes along very well with this farmer's version of history as this pivotal moment in our dislocation from the earth, right? But even if we think of ourselves as post-Christian, we still tend to take for granted, as Lynn White says, this Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence except to serve man. Man, well, that's an old text, humans, right? Despite Darwin, he says, we are not, in our hearts, part of the natural process. We're superior to it, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. Here's a way to sum that up. For traditional Christianity, the earth becomes merely a backdrop for the human drama of sin and salvation. It's where that drama plays out. Which implies, of course, that it's all a means to this greater end for our salvation. And that the earth in itself, it's devalued. Does that make sense?
Could you repeat that?
Just the very end here? Yeah. Backdrop, yeah. For traditional Christianity, the earth becomes merely a backdrop for the human drama of sin and salvation. Yeah. And I think for many people it still is, right? I think I mentioned yesterday talking about good versus evil, and there's a fair number of people for whom what's really going on here that's important is this cosmic struggle between the godly forces of good and the satanic forces of evil, and it's really important that we're on the good side, and sort of the meaning and value of the earth in and of itself, that just tends to be all lost in the process. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but not much, I think. Now, so that's the one side, though. You remember yesterday I was making the point that Western civilization has two fundamental sort of historical roots. The Abrahamic, the Judeo-Christian is one, but the other one is the Greek, right? We think of that wonderful era, classical Greece. We think of democracy. We think of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. Some really profound change happened there. And part of that change is that the Greeks seem to have been the first to make this momentous decision, discovery, invention, whatever, to make this distinction between what they called phusis, the natural world, and nomos, which is basically human convention. In other words, the Greeks seem to have been, at least in terms of our own history, the ones who realized that the way we live together, the way we organize our societies, it's not natural in the way that ecosystems are. In fact, it's something that we can decide. It's our construct, and if we don't like the way it's working, we can reconstruct it, which is exactly what the Greeks did. There was a particular period in Athenian history when they were having some real strife, the different tribes, and the way they resolved it was to sort of reorganize themselves into a kind of, male democracy. And the presumption behind all this is that you could actually restructure society. It's not as though the way society functions is inherently natural or inherently sacred. Now, why do I go on and on about this? We all know this, right? And yet, no, when you go back to the archaic civilizations, that's not the way they understood the way human society is structured, right? For them, the kind of hierarchical structure where you have, the laborers and the nobles and the priests, and then you'll have the king or the emperor, usually male, right, at the very top. This is natural. This is just the way things are, the way things should be. And one of the reasons is that guy at the top, again, it's usually a guy, he is a god or godlike, or he is the one who is in a very privileged special position because he's the one who has the responsibility to negotiate or communicate with the gods, with the heavenly realm, right? Compare this with, say, Plato. If you ever took an introductory philosophy course, you might well have read Plato's Republic, right? What's he doing in the Republic? Well, and also in another dialogue, The Laws, he basically offers a schema, a model for an ideal society. And now we read that, we kind of take it for granted. We have all sorts of utopian visions. But for the time, that was incredible. Again, taking for granted the realization that, hey, yeah, we have this potential to restructure ourselves. We don't have to do things the old way just because that's the way things always have done. I want to dwell a little bit more on these pre-Greek archaic societies because there's something really important here that we need to realize, something important that they had which we have lost. And again, this is going to point at the dukkha, the dissatisfaction, the discomfort that I feel today, right? So when you look, and it's amazing because we can look at Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient China, but we can also look at the New World societies that the Spanish and Portuguese discovered, right? The Incas, Aztecs, Maya. What's fascinating about all of them is that our contemporary distinction between secular and sacred simply doesn't apply, right? The religion is fully embodied in the way the social structure is created. So the king is not only what we talk about as a secular authority, but the king is actually the high priest, or as I just said a moment ago, or God, or God-like. They didn't make that distinction. The kind of religion they had was very much embodied in the way that their society was structured, which is why their society was sacred, which is why you couldn't change it, right? You might occasionally have people come around who would knock off the king and assume that position for themselves, but generally, those societies understood themselves as sacred. And here's the kicker. The reason they were sacred is that they had a sacred role to play, being part of something greater than themselves. Sound familiar? Being part of something greater than themselves, being part of the natural order. All of these societies, this is amazing to me, but all of them believed that they had a role to play to keep the cosmos working. And that if they didn't play that role, things would fall apart. Maybe the best example, the one maybe that we're all, I assume, most familiar with, the Aztecs, right? They had a kind of gruesome practice that maybe none of us right? They would drag their war captives up to the top of their step pyramids, and they would cut out their still bleeding hearts with obsidian knives. Why would they do something awful like that? Because they offered them to the sun god, right? Well, why? Well, because they believed they had to feed the sun god, and if they didn't do it, I'm not clear whether he would get angry or just lose his way, but you wouldn't want to find out. It would be a big problem. In other words, humans felt that they had a role to play in the cosmos. Same thing, say, with the Egyptians, with the Mesopotamians. The Mesopotamians believed, for example, that we had been created as slaves to the gods. So they had their ziggurat temples as the homes of the gods, and we had to do sacrifices. The whole point of a sacrifice, which is very widespread, is the sacrifice is feeding, keeping the gods happy, which is necessary in order to keep the cosmos kind of working, right? Does that make sense? But so notice the two sides to it here. This is quite interesting. On the one hand, I suspect that none of us would like to live in that kind of Aztec society, or Mesopotamian for that matter, right? And yet, they had something important that we have lost. Because they felt that they were a part of something greater than themselves and they had a role to play, they had a kind of social security that we no longer have. Indeed, something we can hardly conceive of. Because they understood their society to be built into the cosmos, their social function was also built. So both personally and collectively, they knew why they were here, and they knew what they had to do. What about today? This is quite striking, I think, the contrast today, right? The meaning of our individual lives and our societies as a whole has become something, well, we have to decide for ourselves. In a universe whose meaning, if any, is unclear. A meaning whose universe, if meaningful, is not something we agree on. Right? So religion in the modern world, and again, we appreciate this distinction between church and state, but religion in the modern world has become a matter of personal preference, something we celebrate. But the fact that we have options tends to diminish the psychological security that would exist, right, if you had exclusive affiliation. So in other words, we have so many freedoms and potentialities that these archaic societies did not. And we wouldn't give them up. But the psychological cost of those freedoms is that we have lost the basic comfort that comes from knowing your role in society and the role of your society in the cosmos. Make sense? The upshot of all of this, for better and worse, is increasing anxiety about who we are and what it means to be human in the modern world. Loss of faith in the life orientation provided by traditional religions has left many of us rudderless. Our ever more powerful technologies enable us to accomplish almost anything we want to do, but what should we want to do? We don't know. In the past, we could rely, or so we thought, on God or God-like rulers to tell us. But now we're thrown back upon ourselves. And the lack of any grounding in something greater than ourselves has become a profound source of dukkha, not only individual but collective. Make sense? And if so, can you see the parallel? The lack of grounding, right? On the individual level, we have this sense of separation, and one way to talk about the delusion of a separate self is that it doesn't have any reality. It's ungrounded. There's nothing there. because we feel separate from the rest of the biosphere, we too lack that grounding. This situation, I think, is really well expressed at the very end of Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Do some people know it? Let me just read you the last couple sentences of the book. All right? Quote, "Despite the astonishing things that humans are capable of doing, we remain unsure of our goals, and we seem to be as discontented as ever. We've advanced from canoes to steamships to space shuttles, but nobody knows where we're going." Even Elon Musk, I think, right? "We're more powerful than ever before, but have very little idea what to do with all that power. Worse still, humans seem to be more irresponsible than ever. Self-made gods, we are accountable to no one. We're not part of anything greater than ourselves, or so we feel. We are consequently wreaking havoc on our fellow animals and on the surrounding ecosystems, seeking little more than our own comfort and amusement, yet never finding satisfaction." And his last sentence, "Is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want?" We laugh, but we could feel the truth of that, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make, right? Self-made gods accountable to no one else. The sense of separation from the earth. The heart of the problem, I think, why we don't know what we want, is that we no longer believe we have any role to play in the cosmos. Since we know that humans, like all other species, are just accidents of genetic mutation, we are accountable to no one and nothing beyond ourselves. All we can do then is to enjoy ourselves, if we can, as long as we can, as much as we can, until we die. Welcome to the modern world. Welcome to consumerism, which plugs into that so perfectly, right? No wonder we feel dissatisfied and act irresponsibly. How could we not? Yeah. Make sense? I mean, and to sum up, basically what I've done is the first 3 points of the parallel, right? Human civilization is our social historical construct, involves a sense of separation from the earth, but built into that sense of separation is also profound dukkha, profound discontent, such as Harari is pointing to. Yeah? It involves uncertainty about what it means to be human, and collective uncertainty about where our now global civilization is going and what it should be doing. Which brings us to the next point in the parallel, right? What has been our collective response to this predicament? Let me just remind us briefly, on the individual level, it's about these lack projects, right? This sense of lack. And we become involved with things like making money, becoming famous, etc. What's wrong with me is that I don't have enough of something. But since those are symptoms of the true problem, they don't really lead to real satisfaction. Is there a collective version to all this? And I think there is. I've already sort of alluded to it earlier. I think it's our obsession with progress. A very slippery term, right? It comes from the Latin progressus, to move forward, to advance or to walk forward. But how do we know it's forward? How do we know? I mean, is the presumption it's in the right direction? Well, wait a minute, right? The problem is that the term has been hijacked to validate the consequences of continuous economic growth and never-ending technological development, whatever the social and ecological cost. And even when there's problems, when there's sort of problems with the byproducts, a very common response is to think if we just, okay, if there's expensive byproducts from economic development, well, let's just have more economic development and more profit, and then we'll have the money to take care of those problems, right? The presumption of it all is the necessity for incessant economic growth and technological development. Nevertheless, we may wonder, and I think especially now, right? When will we consume enough? When will corporate profits and stock prices and our collective gross national product be large enough? When will we have all the technology we need? And why do these questions seem so odd? Because, of course, we know that the whole idea of enough just doesn't make sense, right? But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Again, sense of lack. Yeah? If progress means walking forward, how do we know we're headed in the right direction? Are we actually trying to get somewhere? Or maybe are we running away from something? Which is what individual lack projects are, right? So what this brings us back to is this issue again of means and ends. Economic growth, technological development can be really good as a means to accomplish something. But because there is no agreement, no understanding of an ends to human civilization, why we're here, what we should be doing, etc., because there's no understanding of that old archaic version. We don't have that because we don't have any agreement or often many ideas about what is we as a species should be doing. What that means is we don't know what the ends should be, so we become totally caught up in the means, right? Economic and technological development, great, but they're great means. But if you make them into ends, well, you know, something has gone wrong. It's just more and more. They're not good as ends in themselves because they can't answer the basic human question about what it means to be human and what we should be doing with all those resources. But since we have no answer to that basic question, none we agree on anyway, they have become the ends in themselves. A kind of, in effect, a kind of secular salvation that we seek but never quite attain. Again, notice the parallels with individual life projects. Not knowing where to go or what to value, our civilization has become obsessed with ever-increasing power and control. What do we seek? Modern civilization is built on this estrangement between nature and culture. No longer feeling grounded in the natural world, we become obsessed with sort of self-grounding ourselves. That's another way of trying to understand this kind of preoccupation. And what we're discovering, ecologically as well as psychologically, is that it can't be achieved, right? We're becoming more anxious, more compulsive, not less. We're haunted by this collective sense of lack. Right? And notice again what this means about how we experience time. On the individual level, the point of individual lack projects is the present is never good enough, but in the future, when I have all the money or power or fame that I think I need, then everything will be okay. And notice how the whole progress story is really about the same thing, right? Things will be okay in the future. If we utilize the present as the means to get there, again, time becomes a means we use. Right? It's this linear. That's better. And we've lost that old kind of cyclic, that, the hunting-gathering societies, their whole understanding of time, naturally, was very embodied in the cycle of the seasons. And we've sort of lost that, and now we're always trying to get somewhere. This way of understanding our collective situation suggests that the ecological crisis is actually unavoidable. Any economic, political system, technological system that has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse, which is our system, right? It's going to sooner or later bump up against the limits of the biosphere. And I think that's a pretty good description of the ecological crisis, right? But there are different ways of understanding what the problem is. A lot of people think that the solution is simply to be a lot more efficient, right? To utilize the technologies. And indeed, I think we can all accept that things like solar panels shifting from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, that's really important. But the idea that there is simply a technological solution to the climate crisis that will enable us to otherwise keep doing what we're doing, is this really going to go deep enough? Is this really going to resolve the core of the problem? Or don't those powerful technologies tend to keep aggravating the sense of separation from the natural world? So if the parallels that I've been discussing are valid, any successful solution to this larger problem, not just climate crisis, but the whole ecological crisis, our collective sense of separation and alienation from the natural world, it must involve realizing that we are an integral part of the earth. And what does that mean? Returning to nature? Well, as we said yesterday, can't do that. Why? And again, this is a fascinating part of the parallel. Just as on the individual level, we can't get rid of the self because there never was one. It's simply seeing through the delusion of a separate self. So collectively, we can't return to nature because we've never separated from it. But we need, nonetheless, to realize that, right? And to transform how we live based on that realization, right? Realizing the biosphere is the ground from which and within which we arise. As we've been saying, we're not in nature, we are nature. The earth isn't just our home, it's our mother. And despite Elon Musk and a few others, we never really cut the umbilical cord. Fantasies about terraforming Mars, I think they reveal less about the potential of an extraterrestrial colony than how estranged we have become from our mother here. And maybe our, guilt feelings. We've messed up this planet so badly. Oh, well, that's okay. We'll run to Mars and we'll do it there too. But as we know, our bodies don't end at our fingertips and toenails. The air in our lungs, like the water and food that we take in and let go, digest it, they're part of this great holistic system that circulates through each of us, right? Our bodies are made of the same elements that compose the oceans, the rivers, mountains, and trees. Our blood is salty because it replicates the salt of the ocean where we evolved. We share at least 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos, right? The great Thai monk Buddhadasa, perhaps the greatest or the most important Thai monk of the 20th century, he put this in perspective from a Buddhist perspective where he said, the entire cosmos is a cooperative. The sun, the moon, and the stars live together cooperatively. The same is true for humans and animals. trees, and the earth. Our bodies function as a cooperative. When we realize that the world is a mutual, interdependent, cooperative enterprise, that we're all mutual friends in the process of birth, old age, suffering, and death, then we can build a noble, even a heavenly environment. But if our lives are not based on this truth, then we will all perish. As Thomas Berry put it, our species has never been separate, but to some degree we have been what some people, including him, call autistic, a kind of autistic species. So far so good with the parallel? Here's where the real challenge comes in. On the individual level, what's the next step? Well, we have the Buddhist path. We have individual awakening. What's the collective version of that, right? That might correspond to the individual awakening that Buddhism traditionally promotes. Thich Nhat Hanh put it well. He said, the Buddha attained individual awakening. Now we need a collective awakening to stop the course of destruction. And you know, we all hear that, we all nod. Collective awakening. But what does that actually mean? What might it actually involve, right? One of the mysterious aspects of Buddhist awakening is this question I tried to answer yesterday, or suggest an answer to. If there's no self, who or what is it that awakens? And you know, I was talking about touching the earth, that famous gesture, whether it maybe somehow implies that when one wakes up, in a way, it's opening up to that which is greater than our individual sense of self or ego self, that something is manifesting in us or as us, right? And in fact, we find people like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim talking about this new cosmology. Understanding that humans are a way that the universe, quote, the universe reflects and celebrates itself in a special mode of conscious awareness. Saying that we are the self-consciousness of the cosmos, or we could say the self, if we want to be a little more modest, the self-consciousness of the earth, right? How the earth becomes self-aware. If we understand biological evolution as the way our self-organizing cosmos becomes not only more complex but more self-conscious, it suggests a different aspect, right? But the big question is, what is this self? Maybe we could understand human society or human consciousness as it usually is as kind of a halfway point. There's a self-consciousness that gives us a different level of consciousness than we find apparently with other species, but there's still the delusion of a separate self. And from this perspective, you might even think about someone like the Buddha or the path is kind of completing this process. There's the self-consciousness, but maybe that's necessary to go take this step further and to realize what it is that we are how we are, you know, this getting beyond self-consciousness, the delusion of separation, and realizing that we are, you know, manifestations. We are the consciousness of the earth, right? Thich Nhat Hanh's claim that we need a collective enlightenment to stop the course of destruction, I think it points to the fact that we now need to evolve spiritually in order to survive physically. And I do have the sense the ecological crisis is in effect the earth is telling us, hey guys, wake up or get out of the way. So sometimes there's this sense we're being challenged. And if we don't respond appropriately to that challenge, then we're going to suffer. We're going to experience collectively the consequences, right? But if that's true, it becomes all the more urgent to kind of clarify, what does collective enlightenment mean? If we can understand somebody like Gautama Buddha, right, the historical Buddha, as a kind of prototype for the larger cultural transformation that's necessary, does collective enlightenment mean that a significant percentage of human beings have to follow something like the Buddhist path and wake up? If so, we could be waiting for a long time, right? I mean, I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. And as we know, the ecological crisis isn't going to wait on that. Or is the problem that our understanding of enlightenment might be too narrow? Are we maybe looking in the wrong place? Missing what we're looking for, a social revolution in consciousness and engagement that may already be happening. And one of the ways I think it's coming out is generational. You know that progress story that I was talking about a few minutes ago? I grew up with it. I think most of you, we all grew up with it. I don't think teenagers now are growing up with it in the same way. You know, they can see it's a bit of a con, right? That LAC project isn't working because it's just destroying the earth, and that's something that they're going to have to live with. So there's a sense of urgency and looking for a new kind of collective LAC project. You know, and of course for some of them, think of somebody like Greta, it's this passionate concern to, hey, let's get off our butts and actually do something, come on. This urgency that they feel, right? That they have to feel, because they're going to be living with the consequences. Again, what would collective enlightenment be like? And here I'm reminded of something Paul Hawken wrote, right? Some of you are familiar with his book, what about Blessed Unrest? Yep. He's written a number of things, important things since then too. And I don't know if you know, he's a Zen student. He was part of the San Francisco Zen Center there, right? The subtitle of Blessed Unrest is How the Largest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why No One Saw It Coming. And I wonder if we can see this coming as part of this collective awakening that's beginning to happen. In that book, he documents the emergence of a worldwide network of socially engaged organizations that has arisen in response to our situation, right? Not only ecological, but also social justice. This movement of movements, that's what he calls it, is both the largest ever in history, at least 2 million organizations. Most of them very small. But here's the point. It's kind of springing up organically. You know, nonprofits, they're not about people, you know, I'm going to get rich doing this or I'm going to get famous doing this. No, they're actually springing up in a certain way. It's both the largest and the fastest growing. The first time in history, he says, that a movement of such scale and breadth has arisen. Within every country, city, and culture in the world, with no leader, no rule book, or central headquarters. It's vast, and the issues broadly defined as social justice and the environment are not separate at all. And most striking about this is the metaphor that he uses to describe the movement. It is, quote, the immune response of the earth, of humanity, arising to protect us and the planet from the forces that are despoiling our world. The organizations that compose this movement are social antibodies attaching themselves to the pathologies of power. And he has a whole chapter in his book unpacking this idea of immune system. Just as the immune system recognizes self and non-self, he says, the movement recognizes what is humane and what is not humane. The word immunity comes from the Latin immunis, meaning, get this, ready to serve. Our immune system is that system in our own body that is ready to serve when problems. But I can't think of a better definition of a bodhisattva, right? Are these groups, part of the immune system of the earth? Is this how the earth, in some profound way, is trying to heal itself? Note that an immune system is part of something greater than itself, which it serves by defending. You think about white blood cells, right? They don't have a problem figuring out what their role is. Given the kinds of infections that confront our collective immune system today, the parallel seems quite obvious. We are here to help the earth heal. A healing that will also heal us. Again, please notice the parallel, the question of meaning, right? On the individual level, the lack projects, the kind of meaning that involves, trying to ground ourselves, trying to fill up this void at the core, trying to make ourselves feel more real. And therefore that implies a meaning of our lives is very much what's in it for me, right? How can I get what I think I need? Versus the bodhisattva shift to, okay, I'm part of this, what can I do to make this better for all of us? And then transferring it to this problem that is connected with our sense of separation from the earth, right? The archaic societies, like the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, they believed they had a role to play because they were part of something greater than ourselves. Do we have a role to play? Is this the role we need to play because we are part of something greater than ourselves that our Buddhist practice puts us in touch with and gives us this meaning to our lives? This may be a new way of understanding the Buddhist path, but this path is not new, as Hawkins says. Quote, in terms of commitment, I think Buddhist practice is by its very nature social change. It cultivates compassion, the source of transformation. The word means, right, compassion, suffer with or suffer together. Compassion arises from a deep place of receptivity, openness, listening. That is the beginning of healing. What we're talking about broadly is the healing of the world. And as a Zen practitioner, he sees Buddhism as an important part of this movement, right? Buddhism as an institution, he says, will become much more engaged in social issues because I cannot see a future in which conditions do not worsen for all of us. The gift of the years ahead is that we can't address the issues of our time and be the same people we are today. Dukkha, suffering, has always been the crucible of transformation for those who practice, for those on the path. In other words, Buddhism isn't about avoiding suffering, but facing it and being transformed by it, which suggests there may be a lot of transformation in our future. Because Hawkins focuses on social engagement, he doesn't emphasize that this is really the beginning of a fundamental transformation in our consciousness, which is what I'm reflecting on when, in response to this question, what would a collective enlightenment be, right? But he makes the point, quote, today millions of citizens work on behalf of people they will never know or meet. And it's astonishing that altruism guides and permeates the fastest growing movement in the world. Think about that. When we're engaged, spending a lot of our precious time and energy and maybe money in doing what we can to address the ecological crisis, why are we doing that? We're doing it for the sake of people, maybe species, maybe, things that we will never meet. This doesn't sound like the capitalist mentality, does it? I mean, there's something going on here, something very different. In an interview, Joanna Macy makes the same point. Quote, and Joanna Macy, as you may know, is the great mother of all of us in this movement, right? Wherever I go with workshops, I find the readiness to experience a collective awakening. I'm astonished by how explicit this is. It's a sense of wanting to belong to the earth, aching for reverence for the earth. Again and again, I believe that people would be ready to die for our world, to save the life process. There is something pressing within the heart-mind that is just huge, and it's happening very fast. End quote. So is the collective enlightenment that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, is it happening? As a small part of this worldwide movement with so many dimensions is Buddhism, socially engaged Buddhism. Is it playing a distinctive role here? Distinctive, but encourages not only the liberation of consciousness, but the application of that liberated consciousness, or consciousness, seeking liberation, to the social and ecological issues that challenge us today. Nonetheless, we also have to remember something that Hawken emphasizes, that immune systems sometimes fail. And, quote, this movement most certainly could fail as well. Think about HIV, right? How does HIV and AIDS work? Well, HIV destroys the immune system and that's it. It remains to be seen how resilient the biosphere's ecosystems are and how resilient this collective immune system, which, to be quite frank, I think in some way we're all part of, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? It remains to be seen how resilient that collective immune system is, and what difference it will make. So to sum up yet again, I think this, for me, really extraordinary parallel, right, about the individual sense of separation, the dukkha, the lack projects, the path to wake up that actually resolves the sense of lack. The parallel between the individual level that Buddhism, I think, has always been teaching, the parallel between that and the collective situation that we are confronted with right now. I think this is really important. And perhaps the main way it's important, or one of the really important implications, is that it's reminding us, to say it yet again, but I think we always have to keep this in mind, right? That the ecological crisis and the social justice aspects of it as well, right? That the ecological crisis is not just technological problem, economic problem, political problem. Fundamentally, it is a spiritual problem. And we have to become aware of that, and we have to consider, therefore, what role our spiritual practice might play in helping us respond appropriately. Does that make sense? I'll stop there.